topic that is an important focus of the MVP program: environmental justice, community engagement, and climate vulnerability. Your hosts today are myself, Carrie Ann Petrick. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Berkshire and Hilltowns Regional Coordinator, along with Andrew Smith, whose pronouns are he, him, and
Hello.
is the Regional Coordinator for the Greater Connecticut River Valley. I would also like to say thank you to the entire MVP team who are behind the scenes right now, making this webinar happen. We are recording, and for many of us presenting on this webinar, it is our first time presenting virtually to such a large audience, so please be patient with us. Also, as a not so subtle hint, many of the pictures in this presentation are engagement ideas that come out of the MVP Community Engagement Guidelines, which we will talk more about later today. Next slide, please. If you take a look at the map of Massachusetts on the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, it is easy to understand how watersheds lay the foundation of our physical landscape, and to imagine how changes in precipitation, for example, will play across this landscape. However, these watersheds are also the foundation for our social landscapes, our homes, children, families, elders, how and where we get our food and healthcare, to name a few. We all know that our social landscape is not an equal experience for all communities, especially when talking about climate change. With climate change expected to exacerbate current and future vulnerabilities in our communities, the MVP program strongly encourages municipalities to approach their planning grant and action grant projects with a clear focus on addressing existing environmental, economic, and social disparities. Some municipalities in the MVP community do not have defined EJ communities. However, this does not mean that we are untouched by the need to engage environmental justice communities. When we consider the lessons of the watersheds, we are asked to pay attention to how the water moves through a place. This is also true when considering environmental justice and climate vulnerability. Who are the people that move through your town but may not live there? Who works in the stores, on the farms, as landscapers, drives the buses? These are also important members of our communities. Next slide, please. In the spirit of continuous improvement, this fall, the MVP team conducted a series of surveys to get a pulse on how the MVP program is doing and where we can improve. One of the messages we heard was that the MVP community would like more opportunities to learn from each other. So we created this webinar series and structured it in a way that focuses on letting MVP action grant teams tell their stories and lessons learned. When we asked what topics you all are most interested in, these were the top choices: nature-based solutions, environmental justice and community engagement, and regional collaborations. Next slide, please. This is our second of 3 webinars. The third is on regional partnerships, and we encourage you all to attend. We have an excellent lineup of projects that model different regional approaches to action grant projects. Our first webinar on nature-based solutions was interrupted halfway through, so we will be rescheduling the second half. Stay tuned. Again, we are recording, and we ask that you use the chat box for questions. After each presentation, there will be a moderated Q&A by Andrew Smith. Please get your questions in the chat box early. If our meeting is interrupted by outside groups, we will close the meeting and find a new time to reschedule, and we'll email you this information in the next day or so. Yes, we will be sharing the recordings of these webinars on our website. And with that, I would like to introduce the MVP Team Project Manager, Kara Runston, for a few announcements.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Kara Runston. As Carrie Ann said, I'm the MVP Program Manager, and I use she, her pronouns. a couple of quick announcements that I wanted to make while we have you all here. The first one is that we have a new and improved MVP website. It's resilientma.org/MVP. We'll put the link in the chat. But this should be the first place you go, and we'll direct you to all the right places for all the information you'd need for MVP. The homepage has information on our grants, links to some new toolkits that we have created on topics of interest. One of them is environmental justice and equity, so related to this webinar. And it also has access to previous newsletters, press releases, and other webinars that we've done. It's important to note that the first time you visit the page, you might need to refresh it. It might show the old page, so look for this banner and you'll know you're at the right place. Next slide, please. The other big new thing that's going on right now is that we just opened our expression of interest prior to the fiscal year 22 MVP action grant round. And we expect that round, the formal application, to come out at the end of March or early April. We heard from the feedback survey that we did in the fall that people were really interested in this expression of interest opportunity. And basically, it just makes more systematic what we have done before in terms of talking to applicants about their project ideas prior to the RFR release. It's a really short form where you fill out information about your project idea, and that will basically set up a 30-minute call with your regional coordinator to talk about it and provide feedback. Right now, it's just open to eligible municipalities, so MVP designated communities can fill it out, and we ask that you fill it out by February 26th. And remember that once the formal application comes out, we are not allowed to talk about specific project ideas, so now is really the time to do so. Information about all of this was in our newsletter that came out last week, but if you have any questions on any of it, definitely reach out to me or one of the regional coordinators, and we would be happy to assist you. So I will turn it back to Carrie Ann.
Thanks, Kara. Hillary, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a quick rundown of our agenda for the day. We'll be starting with environmental justice in Massachusetts with our EEA's Environmental Justice Director and Deputy Director, followed by the Malden River Project team, and then the Great Barrington Project team. And then I'll talk a little bit about the MVP Environmental Justice Toolkit. At the end of the webinar, we're going to have cross-state learning in small group sessions. Again, we heard from you all in our survey that you would like more time to learn from each other. So we've set aside this time for you all to introduce yourself and some of the projects you are working on. This is an unstructured time where you could also consider discussing how you're weaving in community engagement throughout your projects. Next slide, please. And with that, I introduce Rishi Reddy and Valerie Cardozo.
Can I go ahead, Carrie Ann? Is that?
Please.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this training. I'm Rishi Reddy. My pronouns are she, hers. I've been in the role of Environmental Justice Director for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for about a year now. And today you'll be hearing from me and Deputy Director Valerie Cardozo about the way in which we're incorporating environmental justice principles across all of EEA. So that means all 6 of our line agencies that deal with environment and energy across the Commonwealth, as well as the internal offices to EEA, such as the MEPA office, Coastal Zone Management, the Environmental Police, and the Office of Technical Assistance. And I'll also go into more detail about the way that, actually Valerie will do this, about the way that the MVP program can address environmental justice issues and the way that using EJ principles through the MVP grant program could really enhance the work that this program is doing. So could I have the next slide? please. So there we are again, that's us. And we'll go on to the next slide. What is environmental justice? Just to start at the very beginning, I thought it would be good to get us all on the same page. There's been a lot of talk about EJ in recent months, and in prior years. The topic has been around for more than 30 years. But let's start with where we are right now. So if I could have the next slide, please. EEA has an environmental justice policy that was revamped in 2017, and that's the current version that we use right now. We have several other environmental justice authorities. One is Executive Order 552, which was signed by Deval Patrick in 2014. And both of these documents are hinged on language that is in the Massachusetts Constitution. But I just wanted to direct your attention specifically to the policy and some key words there, which is that all people have a right to be protected from environmental hazards and to live in and enjoy a clean and healthful environment, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, or English language proficiency. And we believe that environmental justice incorporates both the equitable distribution of energy and environmental benefits and burdens. So this is sort of the realm that we are in when we speak about environmental justice policy in Massachusetts. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is a very commonly known graphic found on the web, which is where I found it. But I want to call your attention specifically to the square on the right-hand side, which has the caption justice, where we can see what we try to do through community engagement and community participation. Equality and equity are one thing, but they require that we actually are able to engage with the community if we want to get to the point of justice. And if you can see in the justice illustration, it's different from equality and equity in that the fence that has gone up to separate the viewers from the players is actually serving its function, a governmental function, let's say, of public safety, while requiring absolutely no additional resources in order to do its work. And that's what we believe, that when we have adequate community engagement and participation, that the government is able to do its work without having to add any additional resources. So the fence on the right-hand side, one could imagine, was put in place after an active community engagement process by which people in the neighborhood said, we need a fence for separation from the ballpark, but we all want to see the ballpark. So let's put in this type of fence, one in which we can all see through. So that's the goal that we're trying to get to. If I could have the next slide, please. So how is the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs dealing with environmental justice issues today? That's what I want to go into a little bit. If I could have the next slide. So in this summer of 2020, we convened an environmental justice task force, and it is made up of individuals from every single EEA agency and office. Here are the individuals here, and you can see the wide array of specialties that these folks represent. And what they bring to the task force is the specialty that they're trained in, as well as the focus that their agency is dedicated and committed to. This task force will be looking at EEA-wide environmental justice strategy and analyzing ways in which we could do better in terms of public engagement. We could do better in terms of environmental justice strategies, and also where we appear to be doing all right. What have we done that has succeeded? Can we have the next slide, please? There are two main tools that we're using at this time. One is the environmental justice policy itself. The first version came out in 2002, if you look at the column on the right, on the left. And the version that we're working with now is the 2017 policy. If you were to click on this link, I'm assuming that this will be available to all of the folks who are registered on this training. You can see our environmental justice page that makes these policies available to you. We also use something called the Environmental Justice Viewer Map, which has a clear outline of EJ communities within the Commonwealth, and it has an interactive aspect to it. If I could have the next slide, please. The language of the 2017 EJ policy requires specifically that climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency is addressed in all of our agencies' EJ work. And in that way, it incorporates the MVP program directly. So EEA agencies shall consider the current and future impacts that climate change will have on EJ populations. Furthermore, EEA agencies shall collaborate with other secretariats when awarding grants around climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency. If I could have the next slide, please. Here is a view of our environmental justice viewer map. So if you were to click on that link that was on the previous slide to visit this map, you could see that there's a spot there that you could put in locations and addresses and find out if that particular address is in an environmental justice community, and if it is, what criteria warrants it to be counted in an EJ community. If you look to the lower right-hand side of this slide, you see the key to the map, which has yellow for minority populations, green for low-income populations, and blue for English isolation language, limited English proficiency populations. There's a variety of other map overlays that you can see on the upper right-hand side of the slide as well. So I invite you all to visit this site, see where your community may be on this map, and find out a lot more about the demographics of your area that you're working in. Could I have the next slide, please? How did we get here in terms of our environmental justice work? If we could go to the next slide. The reason that we have a lot of the environmental justice issues today in our Commonwealth does date back to a historic redlining practice from the 1930s and 40s. So a lot of our modern issues relate back to the way in which neighborhoods were carved out in this post-Depression world when the government was involved in rating neighborhoods as desirable or undesirable, and inviting folks to live in certain areas and inviting others to not live in certain areas. So a lot of this assessment, frankly, was done on the basis of race, and we are still feeling the effects of that type of historic redlining today. You can visit these links to find information that was put online recently by the University of Richmond in Virginia, where they've digitized some of these redlining maps and made them available online to anybody to see where their community fell in this historic grading system. So if I could get to the next slide, please. When you do this, you find a remarkable parallel between old redlined neighborhoods meaning places that were considered to be, quote, undesirable, and where certain segments of the population were frankly directed to place their homes there. So these were often neighborhoods of color. They may have been immigrant neighborhoods. And here I chose to depict Boston here because most of us are more or less familiar with aspects of Boston. And you will see that the red portions here on this map were the redlined sections. The yellow portions were one step up. So the redlined sections were level D, the yellow sections were level C, and level A was considered to be the most desirable. If you can go to the next map, please. And here we have our modern EJ neighborhoods overlaid on these maps. So the places that are hot pink are the modern EJ neighborhoods. The places that are bright red are where EJ and the old redlined neighborhoods, the level D neighborhoods were. Now, I just want to, if we could spend a little more time on this, which we can't today, I'd be able to tell a little bit more about the details about why this correlation is so remarkable. So some chunks of what is now the hot pink is actually Logan Airport, if you see it to the right-hand side. And those neighborhoods are considered EJ neighborhoods because of the number of homeless that are living there that may not have been considered redlined, quote, neighborhoods in those days. So, but you can see that huge parts of Roxbury are EJ neighborhoods today, and that they were redlined neighborhoods in the past. So I'm bringing these two maps to the forefront just to give some type of historical context to this type of work, and that we need to approach it with a historical lens to know why many of these problems are so prevalent today. So could I get to the next slide, please? So very quickly, here are some techniques that we're trying to use for solutions to these issues. If we could get to the next slide, please. So our Secretariat has undertaken several forward-looking, inclusive, EJ-oriented actions in the past year. One is the 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap public meetings, where for the first time we've gone out in a number of languages that are highly spoken in the Commonwealth other than English. And we've undertaken an extensive translation and interpretation service to make the roadmap analysis for climate change available to all in the Commonwealth. The next is this very same project where we have included grant criteria that specifically pinpoints environmental justice populations and invites municipalities to work with their EJ neighborhoods and the leaders of those neighborhoods and the residents there in getting work done. The third is the Transportation Climate Initiative, where a certain percentage of funds available through that program will be set aside for equity populations. And the last is a commitment through a number of our agencies for workforce development in the coming green economy, to be able to have folks that are in environmental justice populations participate in a direct and very substantial way in the new coming economy, and to be able to be trained for that type of participation. If I could have the next slide, please. This was Executive Order 552 on environmental justice, which I referred to before. It was signed by Deval Patrick in 2014, and it applies across the Commonwealth. And I bring it up only to show that there is a Commonwealth-wide commitment to this work, and that we are still in the process of fully implementing this executive order. So we finished with some things. That's the appointment of somebody in my position here. That is about the implementation of an updated EJ policy. And the third is a collaboration with the Department of Public Health in putting together a population that shows both vulnerability in terms of public health issues as well as membership in an EJ population. So we have a number of unaccomplished requirements in this regard. That is a governor's advisory council, which is being put together now and is in process. That is also about having a cross-disciplinary, cross-secretariat way of addressing EJ issues. We often find that environmental justice has to do with housing concerns, has to do with transportation concerns, as well as public health, and as well, of course, with environmental justice, environmental issues specifically themselves. Can we go to the next slide, please? The other tool that we have been actively committed to using is enhanced public participation in dealing with environmental justice issues and within EJ populations. So I like to always draw upon the International Association of Public Participation, the spectrum that they speak about here. And if you go from left to right on this chart, you can see that the different ways that communication happens. And it's essential, I think, to know in which category one is dealing with at any time when you're engaging in community engagement. So there is a way in that first column on the left that information is only dispersed outwardly. And unfortunately, often government entities, whether they are local, state, or federal, often think that community engagement is only this level. That is, informing neighborhoods and constituents about what's happening, and the information is only flowing in one direction, in to out. But there are these other gradations that are enhanced public participation and are much more necessary than we sometimes give them credit for. That's the consultation with neighborhood groups as to what they would like for their own neighborhood and for their own needs. The third column here is that type of involvement that travels both ways, where communication is really beginning at this stage. And it's because of this type of involvement that goes both ways that we can even get to the further type of enhanced participation that's illustrated here, which is more collaborative and which finally empowers community members to making decisions for themselves that most satisfy their needs. We could go to the next slide, please. So here are some resources that I would like to leave you with. The policy itself, the EJ Viewer map, our executive order, and the website for the IAP2 folks that have a storehouse of information on the way that community engagement can be enhanced and be made more effective. Next slide, please. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand it over to Valerie Cardoso, who will speak a little more specifically about the MVP program and our EJ efforts.
Thank you, Rishi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valerie Cardoso, and I'm the Deputy Director of Environmental Justice at EEA. I began this role in November, and prior to this role, I was a climate change policy analyst at EEA, and I worked on the earlier rounds of the MVP program, so I'm familiar with a few of the names in the participant list, so hi, everyone. So today I'll be talking about the intersections of EJ and MVP, and the importance of engaging with the vulnerable members of our communities. As Rishi mentioned in her presentation, the EJ policy has requirements for EEA agencies when it comes to awarding grants around climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency. This is reflected in the MVP program's core principle of involving EJ populations in meaningful decision-making and giving special consideration to climate vulnerable populations. It can also be seen in the criteria, the scoring criteria for the MVP program. These requirements are meant to ensure that vulnerable populations are meaningful participants in these processes and receive equitable outcomes related to the projects that are implemented. When thinking about EJ populations, we know that we're already disproportionately impacted by existing health vulnerabilities, such as higher rates of environmentally related health outcomes. For example, childhood asthma due to air pollution, which is something that I experienced as a child growing up in an EJ neighborhood. Climate change exacerbates these existing vulnerabilities and further affects already disproportionately impacted populations. In addition to EJ populations, we should also be thinking about climate vulnerable populations in our work. There are members of your communities that live or work there who are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but do not meet the EJ criteria and thresholds listed in the EJ policy. We consider these populations climate vulnerable populations. Municipalities with no mapped EJ communities, when looking at that GIS viewer that Rishi mentioned earlier, if you see that you have no mapped EJ communities, you can still have climate vulnerable populations within your towns and cities. These community members are more at risk of climate hazards due to factors such as access to transportation, income level, disability, racial inequity, health status, or age. And to reach widespread municipal climate resiliency, it's necessary that we identify and engage with members of our community who are more vulnerable to climate change, and that we prioritize, center, and empower these populations from the beginning and throughout the planning and throughout project implementation. So EJ and climate vulnerable populations will suffer the worst impacts of climate change because of their lower adaptive capacity or higher exposure and sensitivity to climate hazards like flooding or heat stress. EJ and climate vulnerable populations, they're members of our communities, whether they live, work, or go to the school there. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we understand the concerns of all populations as related to climate change and its impact, and work together to come up with solutions that provide equitable outcomes and meaningful engagement. Traditional methods of outreach and engagement, such as public comment, emails, and open meetings, do not reach all members of our communities, so we must be innovative and consider alternative methods and push ourselves out of our comfort zones to involve groups and individuals that we haven't been traditionally able to reach. So we understand why it's important to engage, but it can often be difficult to think about where to even begin. The MVP team has a bunch of resources for you all to better assist you in involving normally unincluded groups in a more meaningful way, but I'll talk briefly about some ways that you can do that. So an important first step, of course, is to actually identify the EJ and climate vulnerable populations in your community and groups that work with them. Some resources for accessing that information are your regional planning agency, school district, Department of Social Services, local boards of health, or even local churches. Once these populations have been identified, we must think about how we engage effectively with them in a way that truly involves their input. We don't want to come up with a plan or project and just ask for reactions to it. We should try to include EJ and climate vulnerable community members and groups early and throughout our process in a way that shows we value their input and involvement. We can do this by involving community members and organizations from the start, even during project brainstorming or core team formation. We should directly ask EJ and climate vulnerable community members what issues they care about and what types of projects they want to see. There are EJ and community-based organizations, CBOs, in your communities that could already have projects in mind, but do not have the access to resources to actually implement them. These could be really good potential partners for you. You can include representatives from EJ groups as part of your project team and compensate them as a consultant. For example, there's a community liaison model in which CBOs or individual representatives from EJ and climate vulnerable populations are brought on board as paid participating members and advisors of the project team. When seeking stakeholder feedback, we should consider the limitations to their involvement and how we can address those limitations. We can identify languages spoken by the communities and translate our materials in those languages and offer translators at any events or meetings. We can think about where we distribute information. What community centers or churches do the individuals and groups we want to involve attend? What supermarkets? What community events? What newspapers do they read and what radio stations do they listen to? We can solicit a lot of that information from our community liaisons and EJ partners that were identified earlier on in our process. We should also think about the transportation or health issues that prevent some community members from attending outreach events and how we can address those. We can think about how the scientific language used in presentations can be ostracizing and prevent some community members from participating or fully engaging. Someone can speak English but have no idea what the terms you're using mean and how it relates to their lives. In saying that, I think of my own parents who immigrated to the US 30 years ago and they speak English really well. But if they were participating in this meeting right now, they'd have no idea what I was talking about. Lastly, we should also ensure that any input that's provided is actually incorporated into our plans. We don't want to go out and do all this work asking for feedback throughout our process and involving these community members and do nothing with the feedback that they gave us. Incorporating this demonstrates that it was taken seriously and was not just used to check off the box of community engagement. Equitable process and fair project outcomes for EJ and climate vulnerable populations are a priority for EEA and the MVP program. Through the MVP program, we all have a wonderful opportunity to really address the needs of every community member and make sure we're building a more equitable, safe, clean, and helpful environment for everyone. And in order to do that, we really need to prioritize the needs of our most vulnerable and sometimes excluded community members. I'm excited and very hopeful to see the innovative ideas you come up with truly include EJ and climate vulnerable populations in your community resilience building workshops, your core teams, meetings as paid consultants, and to work with them to provide really equitable outcomes in the projects you implement through the MVP program. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Val. Thank you, Rishi. That was excellent. And you offered such great information. Thank you so much. In the task of holding time, we unfortunately have to skip over the question and answer period for Val and Rishi. But the questions that were generated in the chat box, we will make sure that they get passed on to Val and Rishi. So this way they can see if there are ways that they can incorporate those questions and thoughts in their work moving forward. Valerie, can we go back to sharing the slideshow? Thank you. So next up is our Malden River Works Action Grant project. And so I will pass this on to Marcia and Ramon and Evan.
Thank you. Evan is going to begin with our presentation, and then Ramon and I will join as well. So
thank you.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Spatrini. I'm the Senior Planner at the Malden Redevelopment Authority, and we're going to talk to you today about our project, Malden River Works for Waterfront Equity and Resilience. I'm joined today by Marcia Manong, who just spoke. She's the chairman of the Malden River Works Steering Committee, and Ramon Morales, another member of our steering committee. We first of all like to thank Carrie Ann and Andrew for organizing this webinar and inviting us to speak. And we'd like to thank the whole MVP team for their enthusiasm for the project, and of course the money. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with a little history of the project, how it came to be, and the governance structure we set up early on. Then Ramon and Marcia are going to talk about our community outreach efforts and a bit more about the project itself. So what we're looking at here is an aerial view of Malden's Department of Public Works. Physically, this project is an effort to redesign and reorganize the DPW yard to incorporate a climate-resilient public park along the Malden River. However, and arguably more importantly, this project is about creating a new model of project governance in Malden that puts equity front and center and shifts decision-making power from the municipality to the community. Next slide, please. So when preparing for this webinar, we were asked 3 questions. How did the Malden River Works project engage with vulnerable populations? How did this engagement contribute to the project? And what are some of the lessons learned? Next slide, please. So right off the bat, we're confronted with sort of a loaded question. How did the project engage with vulnerable populations? There's a governance structure that's implied here where the municipality has the power and our vulnerable populations are there to be consulted. So we wanted to go beyond that. The fact that they are EJ communities or communities of color does not negate their inclusivity. So elevating their voices to a position of power is central to our work. Next slide, please. So here's a little more information about Malden to give you a sense of why the governance model we developed is so important. As a gateway city, Malden was historically an industrial employment anchor in the Metro Boston region. Malden is recognized as an attractive place for families and newly arrived immigrants. 45% of its population was born outside of the US. Malden's increasing racial and ethnic diversity is often cited as a source of civic pride, and it's home to the most diverse public high school in the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. So the project first came together with a call for proposals from MIT's Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism for the first ever Norman B. Leventhal City Prize in 2019. The prize was centered around urban design and planning projects that focused on equitable resilience. So we were immediately challenged to put equity front and center in the formation of the project. We created a working group to make the initial proposal with enthusiastic support from our mayor. And we were chosen out of 14 projects from around the world to receive the first Leventhal City Prize, including $100,000 that we used to kickstart the project. What put us over the top was our emphasis on an equitable and inclusive governance structure for the project. The goal of the project is to bring together a new coalition of community leaders, environmental advocates, and government stakeholders in action to achieve a common and achievable goal: and build a foundation of commitment and trust that will serve as the basis for equitable resilience work beyond the duration of the prize. Next slide, please. So this is the team we put together for the proposal, which has met weekly since the beginning of the project. We have Kathy Vandiver and Marie Law Adams from MIT, Marsha Minong as our chair of the steering committee, Karen Buck from the Friends of the Malden River, Amber Christofferson from the Mystic River Watershed Association, and myself. Next slide, please. So the Leventhal City Prize sought proposals that do not reinforce existing inequities and won't create new ones. So that became our guiding principle in determining the governance structure and who we would invite to be on the steering committee. Next slide, please. At this point, we were still just the original prize team, and we had to clarify the roles that both project entities would be responsible for. So the steering committee sets and maintains core values, holds decision-making power, and controls funds, while the prize team manages project implementation and provides technical assistance. Next slide, please. So this is the structure we came up with for the steering committee. And the most important thing to note is the balance of resident leaders of color to government folks. All too often when considering what kind of community representation will be a part of these projects, those community representatives are immediately put into a position of disadvantage just by mere numbers. One or two are asked to join and their voices are easily overruled in decision-making processes. So this is the time in your project's development to really emphasize equity, which does mean relinquishing some municipal control. But this is your opportunity to show whatever communities you're working with that they will not be marginalized. And the other piece is the cross-pollination between the steering committee and the prize team to ensure that the values of the steering committee are reflected in the implementation of the project. Next slide, please. So we put together a fantastic group of folks. Our resident leaders include African American, Haitian American, Hispanic American, Arab American, East Asian American, and Kenyan Maldonians. Next slide, please. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is our budget. With the initial $100,000 prize, we worked on a budget and schedule that would take us through a concept design, as well as fundraising for further engineering and construction. But most importantly, we included stipends in the budget for the Malden River Works Steering Committee to emphasize that their contribution of leadership, time, networking, and outreach are all valued. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ramon to talk more about the steering committee and how it functions.
Could we take Ramon off mute?
I just did so, I believe.
There you go.
Ramon,
Try it.
are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'd appreciate it. My name is Ramon Morales, and I've been a Moldonian for 25 years, and I'm also part of the steering committee. Actually, very excited to be part of the steering committee. This picture here, this is the steering committee, not as a whole, but the steering committee and the Leventhal team dedicated to move the needle in our Malden project. We also have a significant number of youth representation, which are unfortunately not on this picture, but this is the bulk of us here. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So we hosted an event for our communities where local families had supervised canoe trips in the Malden River. Now, this was a major success as it drew lots of people and families. And what we found out was that for some folks, it was the first time in a canoe and on the Malden River. So this was a great way to get communities excited and talking about the river on this project. And the people left wanting more access to the river. So that goes to show that what we're doing in these activities are helping us get to where we want to go. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Malden Works on the Malden River. We have meetings, events. In laying the groundwork, we join hands with various people, like-minded organizations, in this case, Friends of the Malden River, and MATV, now UMA, of course, which is our local access television station, and held barbecues informing communities about our efforts regarding the Malden River. And community members also were engaged in the Malden River cleanup activities, as you can see. And this is something that we want to continuously do so that when we get to where we want to get to, we'll have not only the nice part, but a clean environment. And we determined that there was a need to have continuous activities to keep the communities engaged and developing a sense of ownership of the project. So there's a lot of buying into it. Next slide, please. Now, most of these activities you're going to see here on the slide deck, which were held pre-COVID-19 crisis. It includes opening doors to their already established community networks, tabling with posters, flyers at the existing city events held. Also started a lot of conversations. That's what we found out. We also did some partnering with trusted community, religious business, and NGO leaders to spread the word. We also were responsible for maximizing social media other than platforms such as WeChat. We also did some posting on the Malden City Hall and UMA electronic bulletin boards, going to where people gathered. That's what we found out, was spread the words, going to where people gathered. We also did some sharing of posts directly with community groups in Malden. And since then, what we found out is that we want to be able to keep the community informed. The more we keep the community informed, the more we can mobilize the effort and get to our end goal a lot sooner than not. And we made announcements at also various scheduled virtual meetings. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is attending other people's festivals. Here, our project team is tabling at the North Shore Hispanic Festival. And including that, what you're seeing on the right of this slide is one of our flyers in English and Mandarin. Because what we found out was to get to everyone, we needed to be cognizant and conscious of different cultures and different languages. But not only Mandarin, we're talking Spanish, Creole, Italian, and so on and so forth. It was distributed at the Lunar Year celebration and was also included in their brochure. Next slide, please. Thank you. We were fortunate to have held our first 2 public meetings in person at the Malden Senior Center. And during one of the sessions, we brought in a kayak to the meeting as a visual aid to keep the excitement of access to the Malden Riverfront and Center. And 90 people attended our first meeting. It led us to realize our approach was working and that people within our community wanted to be part of this project as well. Next slide, please. So this was a very, very special moment for everyone because we invited a gentlelady by the name of Alexi Torres Fleming. She's an activist, a community organizer, a public speaker, and urban planner from the South Bronx in New York City. Now, interesting to note that Alexi comes with over 25 years of experience in social justice leadership in low-income communities of color. Now, the goal was to motivate our community and let them see that others, just like us, have successfully done what we're trying to attempt to do, what we're trying to accomplish here in Malden, Massachusetts. Next slide, please. Now, during our second public meeting, we invited a gentleman by the name of Terry E. Carter. He's an African-American writer and poet, and he graduated from Summa Cum Laude and Phi Beta Kappa at the Fisk University with a bachelor's degree in English. He's written many books, and I certainly encourage everyone to take a look at them. Terry performed an original piece during our second public meeting. It was called Malden River Works, written just for our project. Thank you very much.
Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm Masha Manong. I'm the chairperson of our steering committee, and I'm happy to be here today to continue our presentation. This is an example of what we would use at our public meetings. At one of our public meetings, we shared a site plan and gave participants questions to answer to spark discussions and get their input on what they would like to see. We would ask questions like, what would you like, or give us one word to describe the Malden River today. We would give them post notes to use, either to put one word down or to give us some written idea of what they wanted to see. We asked what aspects, whether it's physical or natural or social or cultural of the Malden River, would you like to see preserved or enhanced? These are some of the questions we asked that would spark discussions and get people giving us information. Next slide, please. Yes, this is one of our public outreach meetings. We engaged the youth here. It's the YWCA young women who were participating at this table. We also got the YMCA youth involved, the local high school, the Teen Enrichment Center, and even the Girl Scouts to bring the youth to the meeting. Yeah, once we were forced to go virtual, as you can see, some of the attendance dropped a bit, but we are busy working harder and hopefully smarter to regain our highest attendance. One idea we're toying with is the possibility of having performing artists as a draw for our meetings. Thank you. Next slide. Here you have the YMCA youth leaders, and what they would do is they would put up a table. They have a board explaining the Malden River Works project, and they did a great job in spreading the word here. And one thing we learned along the way is, given the opportunity, youth are very eager to get involved, and they happen to be a great magnet for other youth. Next slide, please. So here are some of Malden's Girl Scout troops, and they shared their designs for the Malden River Waterfront Park as well. It showed us that all ages, whether young or old, everyone had something to say and wanted to give input into what our program would be, what the waterfront park would eventually come to look like. So one thing we had to do was, because often because of the age of the young troops, you have to go to them and maybe attend one of their troop meetings as opposed to expecting that they would come to a meeting that you are holding in the evening. Next slide, please. We had 5 design goals of our concept design for the park. And this is one of the design goals, which was flexibility. And basically, it's just a way to accommodate a variety of different uses and types of experience. And this is what we showed to our park. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This was Path to the River. People wanted to be able to access the river. And this was certainly, this is a visual to show that not only it would be easy to access and make connections, but also create opportunities for public boating. Next slide. A third goal was nature, and just the ability to incorporate plants, wildlife, habitat, create opportunities also for learning. Here's a great opportunity for youth, schools to get involved in the park. So public meetings became an opportunity to give feedback, as well as getting new added opportunities for those present to hear about what they liked, what they didn't like, and what might be missing. Thank you. Next slide. This was our proposed design. The important thing was we listened and continually incorporated communities' ideas into the design and finalized a concept design report, which was eventually presented to Malden City Council. And you can see it on our website, maldenriverworks.org. As you can see in this design, we have a lawn area. There's the boathouse with parking and storage, accessible pathways, stormwater landscape, paths to the dock. We have a public dock. We have also a dock specifically for crew teams, benches, lighting, amenities. It's a wonderful, wonderful park that's coming. Next slide, please. I think one thing that's extremely important to keep in mind is that life continues to happen even while you're engaging in whatever your project might be. And for instance, COVID-19 certainly overtook us and became a pandemic and impacted all our lives. We had to change the way we were functioning. No longer could we have in-person public meetings. We began to use online surveys for participants to continue to give input and prioritize, their preferences. Our communication became more electronic, digital outreaches. Our outreach to our community had to change. Instead of activities happening at tables that we were able to have when we initially started, those activities began to happen in breakout rooms. We set up breakout rooms where each room would have a facilitator, a note taker, and someone to report back main ideas when we came back to the main group. And we found that we became even more dependent on our community leaders to spread the word and stay in touch with their residents in their community to bring them out to the meeting. Next slide, please. Another example of life's impact while you're working on our project was the unfortunate death of George Floyd, who was killed by a racist white supremacist. We could not ignore nor remain silent with what was happening around us. Our project stood in solidarity with Black Lives Matter by adding our collective voice to condemn the system of racial injustice and oppression that allows racism to flourish in America. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "It is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people." In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In the face of such profound sadness, I was proud of the entire Malden River Works project, inclusive of our prize team and the steering committee and Mayor Christensen, all of whom signed the statement. Next slide, please. We want to share some of lessons learned. I think the biggest place to begin is commitment to building a governance structure that is equitable. It's important. Don't practice tokenism. Communities of color are not interested in symbolic efforts to give an appearance of diversity. They want real diversity and inclusion. Trust and respect are essential components of success. At the beginning of any project is where you commit to an equitable process or not. It would be great to begin your project relationship with an assumption of trust, but that doesn't always happen. We both come to the table with our own baggage and unfortunately mistrust. So remember, this is a relationship that you are trying to build. Trust and respect are essential components to success of the project. but it takes time to build that trust and respect. As long as you're being honest and your intent is good, you're willing to give up some controls and share responsibilities and share, it will be a tremendous help to your project. Active participation in community outreach are invaluable to success, and that you get specific commitments from your community leaders. Get everyone, for instance, to commit to bringing 5, 10 people to the meeting. It helps. People like to be asked their opinion and know that it is valued. This is very important. People like holding community meetings at a time that is best for if you your audience are employed community members or students, holding a meeting at 1 o'clock won't get the attendance you expect. So you have to consider your audience, you have to consider the community, and make it at a time that's convenient for them. If you can't, well, this was pre-COVID. Right now we're not having in-person, but we provided food or snacks, and one thing that was critical was finding ways to decrease the barriers that keep communities participating. Next slide, please. Getting the youth involved is very important. They have lots to offer, and they want. We aren't providing childcare because we're now virtual, but what that may mean is that you allow, you have people who are participating in your meetings, and perhaps there are kids in the back, kind of things. Meeting people at their place of cultural comfort is integral to true engagement. When people feel comfortable, they are at ease, and the engagement flows more openly and easily. Finding ways to accommodate multiple languages. Language access is extremely important. All too often, people are excluded from participation because of language. So you have to keep in mind that not all of your participants are English speakers. And not only, I heard someone mention earlier about using language that people can understand, it's also about being able to translate and interpret. Not only your flyers, but having those services available at your meetings. Listening, as far as we are concerned, is absolutely fundamental to an equitable process. Processes must be collaborative and ensure all voices are heard, but not all just heard. That means being able to incorporate as many ideas as your project can accommodate into the process. Building equity takes time and on-the-ground communication. We are proud of our project and the fantastic people who have worked hard to make it a success, but don't be fooled. It doesn't always go smoothly, but you adapt, you review what you did and didn't, you look at what worked, what didn't work, and you make changes. We are also learning in this process. Keep in mind the project you are working on is a relationship you are building with the communities that you work with. That relationship should be transformational, not transactional. Thank you very much. Think outside the box, and we're very happy to have this opportunity to present to you.
Thank you so much, Marcia and Ramon and Evan, for sharing with us your time and your brilliance. It's wonderful. Thank you. So now I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Andrew Smith. There are some questions that came up in the chat, and take it away, Andrew.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for giving me some time. So I want to start with a question from Lisa Kumpf. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. But anyway, she had an excellent question, and I want to merge it with another question that we had in the back of our minds about governance structure. But her question is, this is an incredible diverse team. How did this team initially get together, and what was it like to build this team? And when you're answering that, could you also talk about how the team became the governance structure and how the governance structure differs from past municipal planning practices?
I also just wanted to note real quick that I unmuted Evan and Ramon because I know you're having trouble with that. So just know that you're unmuted right now, but any of you can jump in.
Well, I'll begin. I think putting the governance structure together in some ways was easy in that, I mean, in terms of selecting people, we have such a diverse community in Malden, and there are so many really good cultural organizations that are functioning in Malden. It was actually easy to find people. There's an abundance of people there willing to get involved, and and as Ramon always says, it's our civic duty to engage, because we're investing in our communities. So I think that aspect was easy, actually. Maybe Evan, you want to speak to how it differs from other municipal projects?
Sure. Well, I also want to add that the prize team, that initial team that we put together to make the proposal was not diverse, and that was because we had to move quickly on a proposal, and we kind of found the people that were already kind of working on resiliency things and activists and the environmental side. And I think that's common to the way that we treat planning processes and these kinds of projects typically, because we don't have a ton of resources, we don't have a ton of time. I'm sure a lot of other municipal governments are like that, and we need to just take the people that are right there, that we know, that are convenient, and to move on a lot of these things. So having that challenge early on to not do that and to expand and create this governance structure that is truly representative of the community was incredibly important. But on the other hand, we really couldn't have done it without that initial prize money. So when when Malden is doing other projects like this, and we're taking a lot of the lessons learned from this from the Malden River Works project in terms of outreach, providing language interpretation and translation, but still without those resources, typically we have an advisory group full of government folks and maybe a couple outside, and hire a consultant, and they do work, and then they tell the community. It's more the inform piece. So I'm really proud of what we've been able to do with this project. I think the biggest impact, the biggest lasting impact is hopefully demonstrating to the community and to the rest of my colleagues as well, and the leaders, that this is really important and we need to invest resources in it.
So what you're saying, it sounds like to me, is you need to be intentional about this. You need to make a deliberate decision to do this work and put resources behind it. And we had another question from Christine Carmichael, and she asked, I'm going to put a spin on this, but she asked, was there any historical distrust between groups that needed to be overcome in this project? And if so, how did you accomplish that? And I want to broaden that to the question of municipal and community relationships. Was there any distrust between the municipality and the community, and the community and the municipality? And how was that overcome, if it was present at all?
Yeah, I can speak to that on the side of distrust for the community. Absolutely. I remember some of our very first meetings where we were approaching community members, And people would raise past experiences that they had, where, for instance, there was a park in Malden, Howard Park, where people said when it was being designed, and they would be holding community meetings and specifically asking community to come out and talk about what they wanted to see. And people talked about how they would come to those meetings and they would give their ideas, and then their ideas were completely ignored. So this particular park, if you will, is in a community. For instance, what used to be in this park, there would be basketball courts and like a baseball field, soccer field, that kind of thing. When they finished, it's an absolutely gorgeous looking park, but they took down the basketball court and they put up a tennis court. You know, that spoke volumes to the people who lived in that community who don't play tennis. You know, so suddenly the park wasn't for them. So what I'm saying is there was definitely mistrust, and people were not hesitant to express that, and you know, some were very reluctant to get involved because of that. We had to convince people that this group and this project was going to be different from the beginning, and that we were hoping that they would. I myself gave an example and said, I am going to trust that this relationship we're going to work on, and that this project is going to be is truthful, and that when they said it was about equity and not just about, you know, that it was the equity in terms of a social equity as well as climate resilience. So I took a chance, and other people did too. And it takes time to get over that, because we all come with those historical mistrust of each other. I'm not sure in terms of the city, but I think they also have some of their own, let's say, stereotyping of community engagement that sometimes can hamper a project.
Thanks. I wanted to jump in there in a very, you know, I think interpersonal way. Actually, when we were first talking about what we were going to do for this webinar, Marcia, you know, flat out told me that she didn't trust me at the beginning of this process, and I really appreciated, you know, that we've been working on this for almost 2 years now. And we've gotten to the point very intentionally that now I have, you know, demonstrated that she can trust me. And I think that that's something that we all need to keep in mind as you're going throughout these projects, is that, like, don't take that for granted, that people are just going to trust you. Really be cognizant of that throughout all of the work that you do.
That is such a good point. We might have time for one more question. Kira, what do you think? Thumbs up, one more question, or should we move? Thumbs up. Okay, so people are excited. What's your next step, and when do you plan on starting construction? It looks great. And this is a combination of Allison, Dixon, and Meredith's questions.
Cool, I'll take that. You know, the MVP action grant that we received has allowed us to hire, you know, we developed a concept design with the initial funding that we had. So now we're taking that further, doing engineering work, surveys, to refine that design and get it, you know, closer to a shovel-ready project. So we're doing that right now. We're hoping, you know, we can start construction maybe the summer of 2022. That would be very nice.
Awesome. Anything else? I have one personal question. Did you say Moldonian? Was that a term? That's interesting. Yeah. I like regional variations. So is that a term for folks who live in Malden?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I've learned that today, so I'll use that going forward. Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Carrie Ann.
Great. Thank you all so much. And also in the spirit of continuous improvement, we are learning about timekeeping and the richness of the conversation, and then how that requires a richness of time. So in scheduling a bit of our webinar, we're going to next move on to Great Barrington. So Hillary, if you want to start back up the slides, that is great. And then we will move into the Environmental Justice Toolkit, and that will take us to our end time of 3 o'clock, and we will think about how we can create networking opportunities for all of you moving forward, and follow back up with that idea. With that, I'm going to introduce the Great Barrington Climate Action, Resilience, and Equity project, and that is with Maya and Jovanina.
Hi, my name is Jovanina Pagano. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm just so thrilled to be here. I can't, I'm deeply inspired and honored to be part of the group that's speaking. And I'm sure that many of the people that are listening are wonderful as well. And I'm just sure this is a really rich group. And just Malden River Project folks, just want to say everything, and there's a lot of this in the chat, everything that you had to say was just really helpful, and really admire your persistent, dedicated work over a long time to bring such a project into fruition. So I am a member of Great Barrington's Strategic Sustainability and Livability Committee. I'm a social worker in my life, and I wanted to start just with a little bit about maybe if necessary, debunking some notions around Great Barrington and the Berkshires. So just to have everyone that's part of this webinar take just a second to think about, when you hear the word Great Barrington, if you even know where the town is, or the Berkshires, what comes to mind, and what associations you have, and what arises in your imaginations. And Hillary, you can move to the next slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to orient everyone to this place. And using just some simple information from the 2010 census data, looking over those numbers, we're a small town, 7,100 people, Hispanic or Latino population 9.1%, back in 2010, African American 4.3%, Asian and or Asian American 1.3%. We know that census data undercounts marginalized populations and BIPOC populations, and Multicultural Bridge, who is Maya as a representative of that organization, estimates currently that actually the population of people of color is greater than or around 15% of the total population. The number of individuals in the EJ income category, and we're going to look at that map in just a second, is 34% of Great Barrington's population. And our we have an increasing population of elderly in our town. So you can move to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to show Great Barrington. Thank you so much. I'm really happy that you're doing that. That's Great Barrington. You can see tucked in the lower west, southwest corner of the state. And you can see the EJ populations in bright green in the northern border of the town, and a small little slice in the center that's both of those places are the areas of greatest concentration of where people live. And you can move to the next slide. So this is a map that I just wanted to demonstrate. You can see the outline of Great Barrington there in the border of the slide. And just wanted to show how much open space there is. And you can see some of the rivers and the wetlands that are part of this region. And people use the word bucolic. It's very beautiful. There are lots of places to hike. There's a lot of green space. And you can also see right up in the upper left corner where the development is, and in the center, yep, thank you so much. So that's also where the EJ population, and exactly where that circle is what's considered downtown, and where the EJ population is defined by income lives. And you can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to show, this is actually a FEMA FEMA data around flood zones. So Great Barrington is there on the left, and right sort of diagonal to that lavender portion. And you can see how, and the FEMA flood zones is everything in turquoise. So right through the center of town, where those EJ populations are, where the greatest amount of development is what is defined as a flood zone by FEMA. And I'm actually just going to talk the rest without slides, so you can either keep that slide up or remove the slide if you like. So I just wanted to kind of center everyone in the place that I'm talking about and who lives here. Great Barrington is also, just a couple of other words about how it serves, the function that it serves in the region. It's really a hub, and it serves really essential, and it serves the larger population, not just inside of Great Barrington, but around Great Barrington in really key ways. It's an economic hub. Many people work here who don't live here. Banks are here. All of the major medical services are located here. There's a rural hospital, community health care, specialized health care. Food access is really centered in Great Barrington as well. Big grocery stores, high-end grocery stores, specialty and ethnic food stores, farmers market. The regional schools serving Great Barrington and 2 other towns are here. So grade, middle, and high school. Entertainment, there's a movie theater. And also much of the social services that serve South County are located in Great Barrington. Mental health services, youth development services, free medical care, services for those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, and that list goes on. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of really provide to have everyone on this call who aren't familiar with either the area or the true nature of Great Barrington and the Berkshires to have us all have a common understanding. And then I'm just going to provide a really brief overview of the project and then hand it over to Maya of Multicultural Bridge to talk about their role and that organization's role and engagement in the project. So the project is called CARE-GB, which stands for Climate Action, Resilience, and Equity, Great Barrington. And really the central purpose is to center the needs of underrepresented and historically marginalized communities into the town's climate change, adaptation, and planning strategies. And as many people have talked about, not from an idea of what those communities might need, or from well-intentioned thinking, but because of collective, informed, responsible, respectful, and competent engagement. Some of what inspired in the MVP planning process before we were formally designated as an MVP community, some of what inspired this focus was some of those planning activities, specifically the community workshop. It was very apparent. The core team made a pretty significant effort to have that community workshop be inclusive and diverse and represent the diversity of who lives in Great Barrington. And that was largely unsuccessful because of, I could go on, but in the interest of time, some of it was about the privilege of being able to be known, to be invited. as everyone knows, or many people know, it's an invitation-only event. So that one had power or some kind of visibility in the community, that someone was connected to the key team, that one could take off work, that you felt safe. It was held in the fire station, that you felt safe being in such a space, and issues of trust with something organized by the town and the state. So we had an intention to engage in some corrective actions, and I think Ramon, as Ramon said it really well, engage in the spaces where those folks who weren't able to be at the community workshop, we had the intention in the listening sessions to go and be in those spaces, engage in dialogue and learn with and from those folks, and COVID interrupted those actions. So we, and then we also were able to see the immediate disparity of the impacts of COVID on different populations locally and nationally and globally, which parallel climate-related events. So that also informed our thinking of the focus of the grant and the project. So the components of the project, and we're really in the beginning of just beginning this. So the focus of year one is an analysis of community resources, stakeholder mapping, and stakeholder power analysis. And phase one, which we are in the middle of, is trust and relationship building. And this is where Bridges' work comes in and is central to this project. And Maya will talk much more about that. Trust and relationship building through a training series and other community engagement activities, with the goal of generating shared language and shared understanding around climate justice, diversity, and racial justice. These trainings are targeted at and meant to include town staff, select board and planning board members, volunteers, and other key town stakeholders. Phase two of year one is a stakeholder and power analysis, and we're working towards that. That will happen in a couple of months, and that will happen through focus groups, multicultural events that highlight diverse populations and their voices, and really listening to their experiences. These conversations are intended to facilitate asset mapping and really are a continuation of what's happening right now, building mutual respect, increased understanding and trust. And phase three of year one is gathering data from all of these engagement activities, shared learning experiences, dialogues, and trust building, and gathering data and organizing that data and reporting back to the town and back to the community. And year two is a more concrete hands in the dirt activities, and the intention of this part of the program is to provide, according to the self-identified, well, actually I'm going to go back and say sort of the description of year two is self-determined and resilient food access. So the intention of this part of the program is to provide, according to the self-identified needs of people of color, marginalized populations, climate vulnerable populations, and high needs families of color in the Berkshires, community supported agriculture shares, CSA shares, starter plants, seeds, and education around growing food and being food resilient, cultivating one's own food, and working with the food that can be grown in this region. So there's a lot more to be determined, and some of what will happen in year two will be very much informed by what's happening now. So we're holding off a little bit on defining that too clearly, because we don't necessarily, because it's self-determined and is part of the engagement and conversations that we're having at this point and into the future of year one project. So I'm going to hand it over to Maya now, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Drovanina. Thank you all for being here today. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
great, thank you. So yeah, it's been super inspiring to hear some of the projects and suggestions from the earlier presentation. So thank you for sharing and for your engagement. So while talking about how our project is engaging with vulnerable populations, I think it's really important to share a little bit about the organization Bridge and how we've been successful in engaging with vulnerable populations in the past. Because some of those successes were actually part of the reason why we were asked to consult on this project and were inspirations for the development of the project. So Bridge is a nonprofit organization that acts as a catalyst towards social justice and racial equity. We are a minority and women-run nonprofit certified by the Office of Supplier Diversity of the Commonwealth. And our certified competencies include training, education, language access, and multicultural awareness. So cultural competency is a lot of what we do. And as a racial equity organization that has adopted a holistic approach to problem solving, conflict resolution, and mutual aid, there are really multiple ways that we create opportunities for engagement, both amongst vulnerable populations, and also including those with the power, privileges, and resources, with that ultimate goal of creating more safe shared spaces for multicultural engagement, and collective learning and educating, problem solving, and growth. So through our programming, we're able to connect individuals from vulnerable populations with key resources to help reduce systemic, structural, or interpersonal barriers, or fill gaps in services, while we're simultaneously empowering those individuals to, within our network, to take leadership roles within the community. So that's one arm kind of what we do, but we also work with organizations and institutions and municipalities to help integrate the stories and experiences that we've learned through our engagement with vulnerable populations into the training and into the consultation and into the education, so we can really include the voices of the people that we're trying to work alongside of, and also bring an opportunity and create an opportunity to physically bring the people and the folks representing the vulnerable communities in the same space with those who have the access to power and resources. So we're building the programming we're aiming to help educate the community at large on how to effectively communicate across cultural lines and create that safe and inclusive space for those that we consider vulnerable. So that really is exactly what this project is doing, and that's the strategy that we're using as a model for our engagement. So the kind of short answer for how we're encouraging engagement is we're building that cultural competence for the stakeholders in the project, developing shared language and knowledge, establishing trust, like Jovanina said, is key, creating safe shared spaces for multicultural engagement, and working alongside those that we consider vulnerable, rather than trying to come up with solutions for people coming from different places and different experiences and different cultural identities. So as Jovanina said, it all starts with training. We have developed a 10-part training series that aims to develop that shared knowledge and language around cultural competence and diversity and climate justice. So these trainings are for not only town employees and key community stakeholders who work alongside and advocate for vulnerable populations, but we also have included members from the vulnerable populations in the training to present those diverse perspectives and experiences as we're laying the groundwork and establishing that foundation. So these trainings were offered in 2 sections, so they were accessible. There was a morning training accessible for folks that worked for their schedule, and an evening training for folks that worked better with their schedule. And this really helps develop a strong foundation. The first 4 sessions are specifically focused on cultural competency, valuing diversity, a self-evaluation, and navigating through those biases that we all have. Then we'll take a deeper dive into the systems of oppression that really keep people sort of in that vulnerable state. So we'll take a deeper dive on race and gender and poverty. And then in the final section, we'll discuss climate change and climate justice with a race, gender and poverty equity framework. So that'll be followed up by the next phase of the project, which is a series of multicultural engagement opportunities for our community members to convene for community dinners and social engagements and focus groups to further develop that sense of trust and work alongside each other to identify the needs and concerns of vulnerable community members. So once we've developed that cultural competence and that sense of trust, then the town will create strategic initiatives and agendas to adapt and mitigate the risks of climate change with that race, equity, and poverty lens. So when we start doing work like this, a lot of people want to rush straight to the action and start the doing. But what we've found is that when people lack that shared knowledge and shared language, and like was mentioned in the earlier presentation, the trust hasn't been developed yet. We've found that people who try to jump straight to multicultural engagement, it's not uncommon that they'll end up doing more harm than good. So when you're thinking about setting the stage for this multicultural engagement, just think about it as like a party, right? So there's a difference between sending somebody an invitation to a party and then asking somebody to dance once they're at the party. So even though you might have sent the invitation and think that you're doing the work to diversify the audience in your audience, you have to create space and an environment where that person actually feels comfortable and safe from humiliation or embarrassment or making a mistake. And those with power and privilege, we have to do the work to create that space before we send the invitation to the party. And once we're at the party, we have to do more to invite folks without power and privilege to dance. So that's sort of our philosophy and strategy when it comes to engagement. And another important piece of this that I just wanted to bring to light is I also think it's important that you have to consider the context of where you're living and discussing cultural competence, racial justice, climate mitigation, and climate justice. So we live in a rural area, so that presents its own specific set of challenges and for the community, and specifically for community people of color in our community. So a few key barriers or issues that come to mind are feelings of isolation for communities of color in rural areas, issues with transportation, food insecurity, and also there's been a pattern of displacement for vulnerable communities that really aligns with times of broader or more national crises. So that's been an additional challenge. So when we're working through challenges like this, we found in addressing these issues that, so take transportation, for example, we found that while doing things like food distribution or engagement, utilizing delivery is a really successful model. So this was helpful during the pandemic because vulnerable folks in our community didn't have to travel to or shop at grocery stores. So we were actually helping reduce the community spread potential. But in general, the delivery model is helpful for folks without a driver's license or without the ability to drive. So thinking about how to make engagement opportunities accessible to folks with limited mobility or access to transportation is really important for our rural community. Isolation of communities of color. I think there's already a sense of isolation regardless of what community you're in when you feel like you're marginalized. And that's especially so in our rural community. But we think that this has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So community convenings were limited in places like churches or traditional spaces where folks of color were traditionally convening. So with no real spaces to convene independently to make decisions within the communities of color, it adds another level of reliance on the institutions that are often white-led. So that's another challenge. Food insecurity is a big thing that we'll be addressing, even though we're a rural community with a lot of agriculture and farmland. A lot of the produce and products get exported out of our community, making it really hard to access fresh, local and affordable food, especially for folks of color in our community. And lastly, this issue of sort of crisis migration. In the Berkshires, we're sort of equidistant, 3 hours away from both New York City and Boston. So right after 9/11, for example, we saw a huge influx of people moving to the Berkshires from New York City and Boston to kind of escape the more urban scene. And more recently, we've seen this happen in the spring as people are kind of fleeing from New York City and Boston to come to the Berkshires. And that's really, we've seen this has had a pattern of displacement of people of color in our communities. So people who are living in apartment buildings that were recently sold off and then renovated and the rent was raised to unaffordable rates have recently been displaced at kind of more alarming numbers than we were expecting. And also we're seeing our Black elders in our community who have lived on properties for decades being presented and almost exploited by kind of people from outside of the community coming in and offering to buy up their properties or their lands. And it sounds like an attractive offer because the property taxes are pretty high in our community. But then that leaves our Black elders displaced without options for affordable housing alternatives. So these are some of the struggles that we've seen and expect to continue to see as the effects of climate change become more recognizable in our communities. So these are the issues that we want our municipality employees and those with power and resources to get in front of, to work alongside the most vulnerable people in our community to develop those solutions that are centered around their needs and their ideas and what will work best for them. And yeah, so I think that is a summation of what we've been up to and some of the lessons that we've learned so far.
Great. Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you, Giovannina. It's really helpful to what you've done to center the conversation also in geography and, hearing from Malden as an urban project and then hearing about Great Barrington in a more rural context. So thank you.
I want to jump in, Carrie Ann, excuse me, and just tag on to what Maya said in the lessons learned that Marcia, I think it was you that said you have to get specific commitments from community leaders. I wrote that down. So we didn't. And it's really a problem. And I really wanted to share that honestly. Our town planner and the assistant town manager is present at the trainings and in the meetings and has been dedicated since the beginning. We don't, I think I'll speak for myself. I had made an assumption that the trainings that are happening would be required, and they weren't. They were strongly encouraged. And, I think that we can all guess some of the reasons why town staff, which are generally really have more on their plate than they can possibly deal with in one day, would find any training, more than, they can put in a day. And there are probably some other reasons, not having a lived experience of oppression or discrimination or marginalization, because most, if not all of town staff are white, appearing. So that's a big lesson learned, and it's a conversation that we're currently having.
Great, so I'm gonna jump in with some questions here. We have a few minutes. I understand that I think we're pushing Carrie Ann's toolkit back to 252, I believe. So one of our first questions from Allison Dixon was, could these trainings be easily shared for replication in other municipalities? So that's the original frame for the question. And I want to branch that a little bit further to why is it important for municipal staff, municipal employees to become actively engaged in the work of building anti-racist, promoting anti-racism, building that work into the municipal, way of functioning and way of life. Why is that an important thing for municipal staff to do? And then second, I just want to say, like, could it be replicated, and why is it important for this work to be replicated in the municipal setting?
Right. So yeah, definitely the training is applicable to almost any setting, right? So there are some things that are staple parts of the training. The beginning portion, developing that shared language and developing the shared knowledge is really crucial for any setting that you're in. And that really has to do with learning about the different cultural drivers or elements of culture that people characterize, or different elements of diversity that people identify with, and how to identify your own biases and biases that exist out in the community. So Bridge, we work with academic institutes, we work with municipalities, we work with banks, we work with all sorts of different institutes. And really the sort of we weave into the trainings pieces that are relevant for the specific group. So we would do a little bit of research and understand what are the issues that are prevalent in your industry or your municipality, and then we weave that into the training work. So yes, they're replicable. And then, sorry, the second question.
How municipalities can work to be more anti-racist, right? Like how can anti-racism be part of the work of the municipality?
Right. So I really think that it starts with this training and education. So like I was saying, a lot of people want to jump right towards like diversifying groups. And yes, it's important to have representation from different groups, but that's a slippery slope into tokenism unless you have done the work to create the space that's actually inclusive and allows for diverse perspectives to kind of flourish at the table. So it really does start with education, and then building that sense of trust. So community engagement, oftentimes it seems like there's a bit of a divide between the people in the municipalities who have that power and influence, and it almost seems, and it sort of makes sense because often they're kind of responding to other people with power and influence. So they're shaping messages to align with that sort of middle class or upper class norm. But really you have to understand how to adapt your message and present it to places that are accessible to diverse constituents, especially ones that are typically marginalized or have traditionally been oppressed. So you really have to do the work to understand where, like some other people in previous presentations were saying, you got to go to the places where people congregate, right? You can't expect them to come to you, and you have to make things accessible, and you have to really exemplify that you are making an effort to develop that trust, because also, like was mentioned earlier, if you don't have trust, then the foundation of the project really won't stand.
Excellent. So it looks like we're almost at time. There's a lot of discussion around terminology, words that are used, and intentionality of those words. It seems like an important topic for another day. It's like a bike rack parking lot topic for digging deeper into words that we use when we're talking about people and how that could harm or not harm people. So it seems like a very important topic. Unfortunately, I don't know if we have time for it. So, Carrie Ann, how do you feel about time? Am I
Great. I'm
done?
going to take it from here.
Okay, good.
And Hillary, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen, that would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. Yeah, there's so much here to talk about. Andrew and I knew when we were putting this together, we thought about making this a longer webinar because there's so much to get into, but decided for attention spans to keep it shorter. But there's obviously a lot here, and we're really interested in continuing these conversations with you. And just as you all have been hard at work on your projects, the MVP team has been working on a variety of toolkits to help with the implementation and integration of our core values. As you can see, community engagement and outreach and focusing on environmental justice populations are very important to the MVP program. Next slide, please. We've heard from many of you that you are looking for support regarding environmental justice, community engagement specifically, but also community engagement in general. While this toolkit is specifically focused on environmental justice and equity, the lessons it provides can be applied to all outreach. In addition to this toolkit, we encourage you all to visit our community engagement guidelines from our RFR. The link is here on the slide. It is full of ideas. And don't forget your regional coordinators are here to help as well. We are happy to talk with you about weaving engagement throughout your processes. So fill out an EOI form early so we can help you think about engagement early. Next slide, please. By clicking on the Learn More tab of the toolkit, you'll be able to find the MVP program definitions of environmental justice and climate vulnerable. The toolkit also encourages action grant applicants to look at our past RFR as a resource for information about how we prioritize engagement with environmental justice and climate vulnerable communities. What I love about the Learn More tab is that it's broken down with suggestions for both planning grants and action grants. One of the most important lessons in engagement I heard from our Environmental Justice Director, Rishi Reddy. She told our MVP team that engagement, especially with environmental justice communities, and as we've heard all of our speakers say today, it needs to happen often and early. So the planning grant stage is an excellent time to be thinking about engagement. Oftentimes, municipal spaces are not the safest for marginalized communities. So creating opportunities for folks requires deeper efforts. One of the many suggestions that the MVP program offers, and as was mentioned by Valerie Cardozo earlier, is the compensated community liaison model. This model is available for both planning grants and action grants. In this model, a community liaison works with a member of the project team, works as a member of the project team. A liaison could be a community-based organization or an individual representative from an environmental justice and or climate vulnerable population who is able to deepen public involvement and community engagement in a culturally competent, sensitive, and meaningful way. Next slide, please. Many years ago, I was working with a city on an urban community gardening program in an environmental justice neighborhood. There were a number of gardens across the city where I was growing food and developing programs for the neighborhood. One of these gardens was in an abandoned lot, or what I was told was an abandoned lot. Throughout the spring, I transformed it into a lush garden, but not a single person from the neighborhood would come to any of my programs. As the Sugar Snap Peas came on, I was able to get some of the kids to start talking to me. And what I learned from them is a lesson that I still hold today. This lot was their playground. They built ramps for their bikes and would play hide and seek. It was a wild space with no rules, very different from a garden. As it turns out, the whole neighborhood wanted the city to invest in a playground, but the city had picked the spot as a community garden. No one asked the neighbors what they wanted. This is not a new story. For generations, environmental justice communities have been left out of the conversation, usually from very early on in the process. And for reference, all of these pictures are from my garden and my neighbor and her dog Bagel, not from the story I just told. Next slide, please. Teaming up with partners is a really strong way to avoid this scenario. Oftentimes, these groups are not specifically climate focused. They're community-based organizations and social advocacy groups that might have a focus on environmental, social, or racial equity in housing, education, community development, or public health. Reach out to these groups. Learn about their priorities. Maybe there's an after-school program that is looking for something new for their students, and you just happen to have a tree planting project in that neighborhood. The options are endless. Working with community groups will help your project learn more about the needs of the community and also about the resources and projects that are already in place. Next slides, please. As I've gone on my own process of anti-racism learning and trainings, one of the biggest lessons has been about how comfortable it can be to skip to the outcomes and actions and skip over the process. This is just as Maya was just pointing out. The process can be a messy and uncertain place and sometimes uncomfortable. Committing to equity in the MVP process can look many different ways and is oftentimes not linear. Rather, it's a spiral where we create the opportunities to pass by familiar information to check in and create accountability to equity. The MVP Equity Toolkit is full of ideas on how your planning and action grant projects can do this. As we've discussed, you can involve community members and organizations from the start, as well as community liaisons. They belong both in your project team and in your budget. Identify how stakeholder feedback will be considered, incorporated, and reported out to the community. If you will use a survey to gather input and feedback, how will you be accountable to incorporating this feedback? As we have heard multiple times through our speakers today, building trust is essential. Letting the community know your plan so they can trust your team and the project. Build in trainings on anti-racism, equity, and justice for the project core team and stakeholders, as we heard from the Great Barrington Project. Create opportunities for continuous improvement. The MVP program is committed to community learning. As I've had the privilege to support municipalities and projects that focus on building social resiliency, specifically of environmental justice and other marginalized communities, I have seen the real-time learning that's happening, as was brought up by Joe Vanina. Consider building into your project ways to reflect on how it's going. How can you put that in your scope? Are you meeting your goals? How can you correct course regularly to be centering and uplifting people of color and other marginalized voices? Please know that this toolkit is a dynamic document. It is through your learning and projects that we hope to grow this toolkit of community learning. So please share with us your processes, invite your RCs to meetings, ask us questions, offer us your suggestions. We are listening and learning too. So with that, that brings us to the end of our time together. We know that there are still many things in the chat that we were not able to get to in questions, and we will use that as an opportunity to reflect as the MVP team of how we can better serve our community. So thank you all so much for coming, and please join us in our third webinar next Thursday about regional partnerships. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Great job, everybody.